I wish I was doing a 1-minute poster right now. So I'm about 12 months out of my PhD, so it's a great honour to be presenting today. And I think it would be great in the future that we have more and more Aboriginal people who are sort of emerging through their PhDs, so we get them up on stage and grow the pool of Aboriginal researchers. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on today, the Muwinia people, who are the custodians of this area we know as Hobart today. This land has a particularly sad history. There was a concerted effort here to wipe out Aboriginal people. It was explicitly Aboriginal people were going to be rounded up and sent off to an island. And that's the history of this part of Australia. Perhaps in some ways it's better that it was explicitly stated, unlike other parts of the country. Look, and I'm a science fiction sort of fan, but if you have a look, have a read of the prologue to H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, it actually does mention in there a human-like Tasmanians, they were called, I think is how it was referred to. The people were referred to, and that they were wiped out by the superior Europeans. So I guess that was the thinking of the time, back in 1898. Thank goodness things have changed, and the Aboriginal people of Tasmania are flourishing and thriving today. I'm going to be talking about using three different sources of data for this, and we're going to have an overview of the sort of ABS, the broader picture. Then we're looking at the Justice Health Forensic Mental Health Network of New South Wales, who are the main primary health service provider for prisons in New South Wales, and their 2015 patient survey, and then some of the work for my PhD, which is still the most sort of developed work I have at this stage. I do have a number of exciting projects that are currently in train, and hopefully I'll be able to present on some of that stuff into the future. So, as is the way we do things in Aboriginal research, we introduce ourselves, and it was quite moving, the Welcome to Country from Dwayne yesterday. I started my career in health as an Aboriginal health worker in my home community of Juddington, and you can see there on the map. I did my Aboriginal health worker training at Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Services Council in Broome. For about 10 years I worked as a health worker in different roles, and then I went and decided to change tack, move into research. I went and worked at the National Drug Research Institute in Perth and began an academic career. I have a graduate diploma in Indigenous Health Promotion, Master of Public Health from UWA, and finished a PhD last year. I'm currently based at the Centre of Indigenous Health and Alcohol Research at Sydney University. The picture at the top there is a photo of my grandfather and his contemporaries back in the day, and almost everybody in my community is related to one of these men. I do feel a bit strange sometimes using this, but it was on Facebook 2 days ago. Another sort of community member had that on there. My grandparents were born before Europeans arrived in the Kimberley. My mother was born in the Mission, and my generation were the first generation of our family to be born in a hospital. I say this because there are different areas of the country have been impacted by the process euphemistically known as colonisation in different ways, and my experience may be quite different to that of other Aboriginal people. I still return home to the community quite often, and there's sort of a photo down the bottom there of me visiting a few years ago. The photo on the right-hand side with me and there's a lady in the white, that's Megan Williams. She's a Wiradjuri woman. She is an awesome researcher, associate professor at UTS, and I believe she gave a keynote a few years ago. She was incredible support to get through the PhD. And there's a few family photos there. That's not my mother, that's my mother's sister. My mother passed away from a smoking-related cancer about 10 years ago. About 8 years ago, I think, actually. And that was on graduation day, and it is a custom for us. My mum's younger sister, Mum Benny, assumed that role when my mother died. And it was quite funny on that particular day at UNSW. She was holding up the plaque and running around like we'd just won the AFL premiership or something. And my partner sort of politely suggested, perhaps you'd like a photo with Michael. So that's how we had that one. And there's a few other family members there, and the two ladies, that's Mum Benny and her sister, with my nieces. And that's actually Mum Benny in the middle with her mother. And that's taken down on the beach of the community out the front. So I still get back there a bit. I do also want to mention somebody else who's been a tremendous support, and that's Professor Sherry Sagers, although she's an adjunct to Endry, and she really encouraged me through the Masters and into the PhD. That is my dad. So I'm Irish, Australian descent as well, and the Irish side of the family settled in the Corowa area of Victoria, or the Victorian sort of border there. So, and my great-grandfather was Michael Doyle as well, so it was Michael Doyle who arrived here some time ago. So I guess that's the Doyle aspect of the name. And I live in Sydney now. So, alcohol and other drug research, when we're doing work with the Aboriginal community, we do need to be upfront and say what the benefits are and be quite clear about that. So about 75% of people entering prison report risky alcohol or other drug use. And almost, we have higher imprisonment rates, and I'll be talking about those in a moment, but almost every single Aboriginal family is affected in some way. I have not yet met an Aboriginal family that says that they are not affected by anybody, that they've either been to prison or they've got a member of the family has in some way, they've been affected. And it's quite similar with alcohol and other drugs as well, sadly enough. So this is a priority to do work around this in the Uluru Statement, which was a consultation about constitutional recognition for Aboriginal people. But this was of such importance that you'll see the statement in there saying that we are not innately a criminal people. And so this really is something that the whole community would like to see some action on. Hopefully with more effective treatment, could lead to improved health and reduced likelihood of return to prison, being the sort of ultimate overarching goal. So, the national imprisonment rate. So from 2008 to 2018, we see the steady upward trend of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander imprisonment. You can track that back through to the 1991. We had the report from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, handed down their report then, and the rates pretty much goes up from there. So there was a slight dip after the 1991 Royal Commission, then the rates went past that level by about 1996 and then continued on. The graph's actually telling you two stories. While you have that increasing imprisonment rate for Aboriginal people, it's only a very slight increase for the non-Aboriginal population. And so while it's remained relatively stagnant for the general population, we've seen this increase. So my work as an Aboriginal man focuses on Aboriginal men. So some of the data, we do have both Aboriginal women and men, but with my primary sort of work when I interview people, it's with Aboriginal men. So this is the rate of imprisonment, and this is the June quarter for 2019. You can see that Western Australia has a rate that goes over 7,000 per 100,000 population in imprisonment. So does that mean, and I'm from Western Australia, that we are sort of more criminal than other Aboriginal people? Well, no. I mean, quite clearly this is probably more to do with the sort of legal system that's in place and reflective upon that. So change is possible if you think about this graph. So even if you got Western Australia's rate of imprisonment down to perhaps Queensland or the ACTs, that would be an improvement. It would still be far, far too high, but it would still be a bit of an improvement. So the other day I was sort of presented some of this work, and one of my Aboriginal colleagues who had been a manager of a drug and alcohol service sort of challenged me on the absolute numbers, and these are the absolute numbers of Aboriginal men that were in prison in that June quarter. So you see there that New South Wales actually has the most Aboriginal men that were in prison, followed by Queensland. And so even with my sort of rudimentary quantitative skills, clearly the only thing that could account for that is that those two jurisdictions have a much larger Aboriginal population. And so New South Wales and Queensland both have about 30% each of the total population of Aboriginal people, so about 60% together between those places. And in the city I live in, and also in Brisbane, they are the most populous Aboriginal locations in the country. So if you had drew a 100-kilometre radius around from Sydney, you'd probably have more Aboriginal people in that radius than what you would in the entire Northern Territory. Now, I'm not saying that in terms of we should be playing one group off against the other, but we do need to remember that there are Aboriginal people all around the country. And that while the Northern Territory's prison population is about 95% Aboriginal, there are a lot of Aboriginal people in custody in other jurisdictions as well. I will say, though, is Australia is very good at keeping prison data, really, and I've wondered whether it's something to do with the first population census of the non-Aboriginal population being via sort of a prison muster after 1788. But we do have good data. So the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, which is used by the World Health Organisation, and almost everybody here should know about this, I would imagine. So the 2015 Patient Health Survey did ask the 10 questions for the audit, and here we're presenting these sort of scores of 8 and above, and you can see that there's a large proportion within the 20 plus, which it's otherwise indicated that there's possible alcohol dependence, and there's the Aboriginal men. And you see there is a difference between those two groups, but there's an even larger difference when you look at the Aboriginal women. Now, both these groups, you can see there is some serious alcohol use issues within this, so it's not necessarily sort of comparing one group to the other is not that helpful at times, because everybody in prison could probably do with a bit of help with their alcohol and drug use. So in terms of daily drug use in 12 months before prison, this was daily or almost daily, cannabis, methamphetamine, amphetamine and heroin. And it's pretty much universal, not just in the prison data, that there is a higher level of use of cannabis for Aboriginal people. You'll see this in almost any sort of, whether it's a drug house survey. These had multiple answers, so they don't add up to exactly 100% because people in prison are often polysubstance users. And you can see there that there would be quite a bit of polydrug use. Methamphetamine sort of is colloquially known as ice, and if you looked at the use of ice as a proportion within this group over a period of time, over the last 20 years, that has exponentially increased. Heroin has actually decreased over a period of time, but we do have methadone. Methadone is great, and we need to continue supporting that methadone be run out and that there is further availability, but it also does have its limits within this group. And there's been a lot of research around methadone, a lot of very, very good research, but perhaps we need to look at other areas of drugs within the prison area. So this is quite interesting. One of the questions was did you commit your offence in order to support your drug or alcohol use? And there was a really marked difference in the answer to this. So 20% of the Aboriginal guys said they did, or Aboriginal people said they did, and about 25% or a quarter of the non-Aboriginal people did. For the non-Aboriginal people, it was almost exclusively to support a drug use habit. But for the Aboriginal people, you can see there's quite a marked difference. And that was to support drug use, yes, but also to support drug and alcohol. So if we're looking at prison-based treatment for this group, we do need to be talking about alcohol. A lot of the programs do tend to have an illicit drug focus, but alcohol definitely needs to be included within these programs. So in terms of the prison-based treatment, we've got In terms of detox, it often actually happens before you become a sentenced prisoner. So you have sort of three stages. You become an arrestee when you're arrested by the police, then you become a remandee after you've sort of been before the magistrate, and then once you're sentenced, if you do go to prison, you then become a sentenced prisoner. So you're normally sort of more withdrawing as sort of an arrestee or a remandee at that stage. A lot of the theoretical framework for prison-based programs in Australia comes from the United States. Not all of it, but a lot of it does, and a lot of it sort of comes from a bit of work known as what works in prison-based treatment, I think. And the treatment programs we have evolved as new drugs emerged. So before in the 1950s, it was pretty much sort of alcohol. But as new drugs have emerged, there have been new programs, and there are now programs for methamphetamine and other drug use. So the types of treatment, we have psychoeducational, cognitive behavioural, and therapeutic community, 12-step and one-to-one counselling. So psychoeducational is sort of more your health promotion. You do have some interaction, but it's nowhere near as interactive as sort of a cognitive behavioural program where you have group therapy, a reflective learning type situation. Therapeutic communities, of which we do have some in different jurisdictions around the country, are normally sort of a discrete community within the prison, in a low security prison. While you don't, being a therapeutic community is not necessarily a treatment in itself. They can use sort of psychoeducational CBT as well as your 12-step models. You do also have this sort of thing of living in a community, learning to get along with people, and all of those other sort of therapeutic things that happen as part of that. In the context of this work, the guys, when I interviewed them, spoke about 12-step programs as being a program, so I know it doesn't necessarily fit directly within this scope, but that is how it is described within this work. And you have the one-to-one counselling, of course. So I am an early career researcher, so this is a paper I published earlier this year, so please cite. If I can make an unashamed sort of... So it did a systematic review of evaluations of prison-based alcohol and other drug use treatment, and looked at a period from 1995 to 2015, which is a long period of time, and pulled out, it was huge. There was like, I don't know, 2 years of my life. It never ended is how it felt, but I did learn a lot. I learned a lot about this type of research that was being done in this field. And so you see there, you won't be able to read all of that, but you can see we started off with 13,000 sort of references came in, and then through a process of elimination ended up at 25. Now, there was a lot of work in there that was actually describing how bad the situation was, the sort of prevalent stuff, but not that much that was talking about programs that had been evaluated. There was a lot of research in there about what professionals thought needed to be done and all that sort of stuff, but very little data collected directly from the guys or the inmates themselves. And that was specifically part of the selection criteria for the systematic review. So in terms of results, 15 of them are from the United States, 2 from Canada, 2 from Taiwan, and 1 from Australia. And when I looked at it further, it was before 2015, and there's been 2 papers published since then, so it would be a total of about 3 papers ever published in Australia that actually are evaluating a prison-based drug and alcohol treatment program. Now, there are evaluations that do take place, absolutely, but very few of those do actually get published and get put out in the domain. So it would be great if more of that is published so that we can learn from that. I evaluated the methodological strength of the papers and found that 12 were moderate or methodologically strong, and those papers tended to be the ones that were sort of more recent. So 4 of them measured AOD use post-release as well, and 3 of them reported a reduction in use, and all 3 had post-care. Only 1 of the 3 conducted an intention to treat analysis, which is really important in this. So All of the other papers tended to compare the group that had successfully completed treatment with the control group, thereby excluding all of the people that had dropped out of treatment. And so those people don't just disappear, but if they're included in the analysis, it makes the actual results perhaps not look quite as good as they might do if they were excluded. So anybody who works in drug and alcohol knows that people who drop out of treatment do not just disappear, so they do need to be included in your analysis, regardless of how that might affect your results. So we had similar findings to the previous reviews by Pearson et al. And Mitchell, and Mitchell did Cochrane reviews in 2006 and 2012. Neither of those assessed methodological quality of the papers, so what we did was a bit unique in that regard. What we found was a therapeutic community of post-release care is the most effective form of prison-based treatment, which is quite similar to the previous findings, but the overall evidence is quite limited. So more work to be done in that space. So I'm presenting this is the primary data from the PhD. I just want to acknowledge my PhD supervisors. This work was, whose names you can see along the bottom there, this work was conducted out at John Moroney Prison, which is a huge sort of prison complex out the back of Sydney. And they've got a low security men's, medium max men's, and a women's prison out there. So there were 17 non-Aboriginal men and 14 Aboriginal men that were interviewed. No one identified as being Torres Strait Islanders, so when I say Aboriginal, it is because all of the men were Aboriginal. They were voluntary participants of a 6-month treatment program, so they were about to start the intensive drug and alcohol treatment program, so this is before they actually commenced that, and I asked them about treatment experiences that they'd had prior to that. I do have the follow-up data that I'm analysing as well. So we did a thematic analysis of those interviews. Now I did the unthinkable and quantified qualitative work in my first slide. But I thought this was the easiest way to sort of present the demographics. And you can see there most of these guys came from Sydney or a regional city, being Wollongong or Newcastle, or regional towns. And there's one guy who was from interstate, and he was from up the sort of Tweed Heads area. The age distribution, you can see it's the 22 to 30 and 31 to 40 are the largest age groups there. The year they left school, so that was a question I asked them, so it's more likely that they had completed year 9, the 11 that you see that said they left in year 10, then completing year 10. One of the guys had never actually been to school. In terms of prison terms, it was 3 of them, it was the first time they'd been to prison, and several had been in more than one time, and 8 had been 5 or more. So their alcohol use background. First use was before the first offence, and normally alcohol and then cannabis shortly after. Now these are all pseudonyms, and this is Owen, he's talking about marijuana. So marijuana, it would have been pot, yeah. Cannabis, I'd say 14, yeah, 14. And alcohol, 12, 11 or 12, yeah, younger. But it was all about the same time, you know, and that was pretty typical of what a lot of the guys said. And you've got Kurt there who's talking about some of the reasons for use, and it was really non-specific. It was like I got pressured into it, and Kurt's sort of saying that his friend said, do you want to try some of this? And he did. And so there wasn't, for most of them, a particular reason why they started use. The supply is often by family members and illicit drugs by friends or opportunistic. So when it came to alcohol, you've got Lee there, and he's actually of sort of Maori descent. And he's saying it was fun, bro. Actually, all of the Maori guys and the Aboriginal guys called me bro throughout these interviews, which is kind of cool. So he said it was fun, bro, yeah. Adults drank, yeah. And then I asked him about that. He goes, it was, well, partly. Didn't really like the taste of it, only liked the feeling of it, you know. And my mates were doing it, so yeah, because all my friends were all older than me. And he was talking about sort of a rugby type culture as well, and that sort of thing, and drinking after that. So, but once out of school, and this is John's story, sort of a white Australian, and he's talking about once he dropped out of school, it just increased exponentially. He'd started cannabis drinking a little bit before, but not much while at school. So heroin and amphetamine use began around in the late teens or early 20s. And John, again, the same guy. Actually, John identified himself as being the ethnic minority in his family because his wife was Aboriginal and his children were Aboriginal. So, which was, he was quite an insightful fella to speak to from that perspective. So John's talking about when he was 15, he used to drink. Yeah, when I was young, we grew up on the beach at Bondi, and go travelling from Bondi to Coogee and Maroubra. We just used to drink a lot and then start smoking pot around 16. And there, I didn't touch heroin or anything until I was 20. I came to jail. John didn't start using heroin when he was in prison, but he went to prison very shortly after he commenced his heroin use. Some of the guys did use heroin or meth for the first time in prison, but that wasn't particularly common. It had normally happened before then. And you've got Dave, who's talking about he went from drinking to marijuana, and then both of those two together, then started using heroin. And then eventually he stopped using heroin and he focused all of his resources on ice, and he just completely only used ice. The offending, there was this sort of cycle of offending. This is described elsewhere, and that's sort of the offence or crime to get the drugs to deal with unpleasant emotions or physical symptoms. So you're coming down, you go out again, and then you take the drugs in order to be able to do those offences. But in terms of when being under the influence at the time of the offence, it wasn't just when they were sort of on the drugs. You've got Jay here who's talking about the day after he'd been using amphetamines. He was catching a train, and the second time he got on the train there was this young fella, as he says there, staring at me. And I was pissed off to the max, so I cracked him. So no drugs, weren't actually involved in me crime, but yeah, maybe if I wasn't on drugs. And he was coming down from drugs from the days before, so it's not just the sort of acute stage of intoxication, if you like. And Ben, who he was talking there about his partner's ex-partner, and this fella who says that her ex thinks he's some kind of heavy. He's saying he's going to do this, going to do that, and I tried to let it go. He just pushed too far, and no, it was nothing to do with drugs. It was to do with my family. He was saying he was really going to kill my girl. And Ben goes on to later say, but if we weren't ever involved in the entire drug world, we just wouldn't have had these situations happening at all if we were just removed from that world. And so it's sort of the consequences of that and having to take action to protect one's family, as Ben felt. So to support drug use, and so this is the sort of stereotypical stuff, and this is what some of the guys said, and that was that they said they went out, committed offences in order to support their drug use. And you've got Kurt's story there, but this was also one of the other reasons, and this was explicitly for the people in Sydney. So in order to support the cost of living in Sydney, people had committed offences. So if you want to rent in the private market in a city unit in Sydney, it's about $500 to $600 for a one-bedroom unit in the Redfern area. And so Jim's talking about having to go out. He felt he had to go out, commit an offence in order to get money to be able to support that cost of living. And he'd been on the housing list for about 4 years, and he'd just had enough. He'd been sleeping on the floor of various family members' houses, and it just had gotten too much for him in the end. So at entry to prison, so when they got to prison, one of the guys had never actually been to an AOD treatment of any kind whatsoever. So he ended up in this prison intensive drug and alcohol treatment program, but had never done anything before. And you sort of have to wonder about how that has come about if there's been nothing offered to that person before they got to perhaps the most sort of tertiary of treatments in this area. 4 of the guys had treatment before the criminal justice system, and they'd all been pressured to by families. And if there's mums out there, a couple of the guys, their mothers basically pressured them and made them to try and do something about their drug use. All of the others were either court-ordered treatment or while they were in juvenile detention or in prison as these guys. So if you think about the criminal justice system, if you thought of it as a collective treatment service, it is like the biggest drug and alcohol treatment service in this country. Now, Adam there is talking about when how he got into treatment. So he'd never done counselling or anything like that, as he says, and then they put him on drug court, and he only lasted 2 weeks because an incident happened and he got kicked off that and then ended up in prison. So prison is sort of the too hard basket in a way for this group, so they've ended up getting treatment through this way. Now, I asked them about the treatment programs and what would make for a good treatment program from their perspective, which was something not a lot of people had done before. So there's a lot of opinions about what is best for this group, but not very many people had actually asked them, what do you think is best for your group? So empathy, when it came to prison facilitators, was the most important quality. The Aboriginal guys said, yeah, perhaps being Aboriginal, and this is all of the guys together, but some of the Aboriginal guys said, yeah, that might be good, but the overriding best quality was empathy and being able to connect and having that kind of skill. Having a gender balance was preferred, because if you had 2 males, the guys felt that the whole program could get out of hand. So that sort of old story of making women the moral authority for men, I guess how that sort of plays out. But there was this genuine, they wanted that sort of balance. Some lived experience, I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But if you had some experience of drug or alcohol recovery, either yourself or somebody in your family, that gave you a higher level of credibility. And confidentiality is critically important in the prison, and as well as being a bit older. So having a drug and alcohol counsellor who's 20 years younger than you just did not work particularly well for some of these guys. So it would say middle-aged or older sort of people in this space works quite well with this group. So asking them about the program content. So it had to be relevant to their use. So drinkers did not like sitting through IDU issues, and this happened, and they would just lose interest. So if you put the drinkers or somebody who was only a cannabis, only smoked cannabis and did nothing else, into a program where they sat through and you talked about methamphetamines and everything else, they would just lose interest and they could potentially become disruptive in the class. So putting the right person as the right type of treatment is critically important, and there is literature around that, and that does come through in this work as well. And it's got to be practical and useful. So you've got Ed there talking about the example of a pouch. And if you wanted to get on drugs and you owed somebody a pouch and you had to sort of give them a pouch back, and working all of those things out, as well as talking through what your mood. And so for Ed, it was a really practical type exercise. The pouch there I think he was referring to was actually pouch tobacco, but it's sort of owing people and having to pay things back and doing all of that and wanting to get on drugs. So having a supportive group is critical, as trust can be a problem. And we've got Jake here who's talking about, and I'll read this out. So, there's a lot of boredom, frustration, and sometimes get people that like to tell tales and talk behind other people's backs or talk about someone else in order to make themselves feel better or for whatever reason. So it goes on to say, but the only thing that you do, because you do become a bit wary of, I suppose, is how much you talk about and what you say when you're in the group, because you're living with other inmates, My philosophy is you can't trust anybody, you can't trust anyone in here. You can't really afford to trust anyone or anybody in here. So there is this, within the prisons, gossip is a commodity. And so if somebody was in a group and they were not necessarily sharing within the group and talking about their own personal experience, the entire group could potentially just close down. So facilitators in that situation need to be quite aware of what's happening, and if some members are not contributing, that can have an effect on all of the guys. So in terms of co-facilitation, and this was one of the things, one of the primary findings in the PhD in the end, There was an appreciation for well-trained staff and also peer educators. So some of the guys said you had to have some cred, you had to be in recovery, but we've got Owen here who then goes on to talk about the benefit of having both. Now, I'm not going to go through and read all of that, but he basically talks about the importance of textbooks, counsellors too, and that people who go to uni and that sort of thing are important. Now, they saw this as sort of a dichotomous. So if you were a peer, you weren't a uni person, but we kind of know there's a lot of people in recovery who do go on to do uni and do become psychologists and that sort of thing. But that was the way it was portrayed by or seen by these guys. So a combination of both a peer and a well-trained facilitator was where we landed with that. So the Aboriginal participants, and so going to look at a couple of those slides, and there were 14 of them, and they were from different locations around New South Wales, but all from New South Wales. So they spoke about alcohol consumption, and this was about when they were growing up, and they said there were lots of drinkers in their families and it was normal. Some spoke of intergenerational alcohol use. And you have Bill saying, well, my family, my dad, he's a drinker, you know, and my mum was a drinker too. My pop was a drinker, my uncles, my family, like I grew up all around that. You know what I mean? And yeah, that's about it, yeah. And that was, even if they weren't actually drinkers themselves, this was quite common with, well, this was almost universal within this group, that they'd all grown up in this kind of environment. So this is a particular sample. So not every Aboriginal family is like this, but this was a background these guys had who were in this treatment program. And you got Neil there who goes on to talk like my father, he had a problem with alcohol, so did his father, yeah. So over the years there's been a lot of, yeah, you know, alcohol, or, you know, domestic violence related to alcohol, but mainly just alcohol. And there was several of the guys who talk about sort of family violence as well. And yesterday's presentation, I have to say, was quite moving with the program from Northern Ireland about those interventions. We certainly need some more work around that area. So drug use for these guys, and when I asked them, well, why did you continue drug use? And so they spoke about they used to block out feelings of emotional turmoil, financial difficulty and stress from conflict. Ian's talking about heroin there, and he tells me, I won't lie, I love it, you know, it's the ultimate drug, it takes all your problems away. He then says, you should try some, bro. I didn't take him up on the offer, but he was, yeah. Perhaps he could just see that I was being particularly stressed with my PhD that day. So several said that they used AOD to function normally. Now, what wasn't an explicit question, I keep on using that word, I don't want to use that word. What wasn't a specific question was racism. And in the analysis, it kind of starts to be hinted at, but it's not directly talked at. And so some of the guys spoke about needing to drink in order to go to a shopping centre, in order to walk down the street. So it's not just talking about drug use in order to not feel so bad because you're coming off drugs. It's a drug use to be able to function in Australian society. And so there's definitely more work within this space to look at the issue of racism. As we know, Australia perhaps does have a bit of a reputation in this area, and certainly another bit of work to be done with that. Many had impoverished circumstances but did not link their AOD use. So they were asked about this directly. So the research will tell us that perhaps people with impoverished backgrounds may be more likely to, not everybody, but perhaps there is some indication with that. But they were quite clear about, I didn't drink because we were poor, I drank because this or that or other things. So they didn't necessarily link the two directly. And there was this cycle of offending that I sort of spoke about earlier, and sort of undertake the offence and then to deal with the unpleasant emotions, physical symptoms and coming down from drugs. They spoke about using cannabis when they were coming off methamphetamine as this sort of come down drug. So 9 of the guys had attempted to withdraw from AOD in the community but found it difficult to access services. So they really went out, tried to do something, they couldn't get a service and they couldn't get into a detox facility. We've got Ray here, who he says, that's the time I tried quitting and it didn't work. The best thing that's probably ever happened for me is I come to jail, now I don't need it. And there was this sense of almost relief some of them had, that when they taken into custody, they then got clinical assistance to withdraw from drugs and got that support. And there was also a sense of relief that the sort of spiral they were on, there was a line drawn under it. So if they were using drugs every single day, then that kind of came to a head and got dealt with. But once again, it's a bit sad if we're saying it's great going to prison because I can get services when I get there. So in terms of these sort of behavioural treatment programs, the Aboriginal guy spoke about this supportive treatment relationship. And Ed, and I'll read this out. If you've got other people there you know, you don't know, if you know them real well, it's good. You've got no problems. But when you're with Kuris, you feel more comfortable with them because it's like your brother. There's a big difference. And there was this automatic trust that was given between from one Aboriginal fella to the other. So you automatically trusted. So the issue that I spoke about earlier, where if you were in a group you would be quite guarded, it evaporated in a Kuri-only group. The Aboriginal guys also said that you needed a sense of humour. So Neil's there talking about the best qualities they can have is just really to put in. I think as long as they know, you know, they got a little bit of a sense of humour as well at the end. And this wasn't a very Aboriginal specific finding in this work as well. The Koori guys did say, do this and do that, and you've got to have a laugh as well. Now, program availability, which wasn't something I necessarily went out to ask, but this became quite apparent that this was an issue. So Jess is talking there about that he'd done 18 months on remand and he couldn't do no courses because he was on remand, and he got sentenced and then he went to the drug and alcohol treatment program, and that's pretty much when things started. So for 18 months he didn't have access to any programs. Now, depending on which sort of facility you're being held in, you do have access. You can go to 12-step programs and do those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily that nobody on remand gets absolutely nothing, but there perhaps needs to be much more thought put into policies around what happens with people when they're on remand, particularly if they're there for a long period of time. And repeating programs was something one of the guys said. So not only is it sort of an issue just getting a treatment program, if you go to a program, it was useful to be able to do it 3 or 4 times, as Carl says there. So the first time it didn't really sink in. He did it 3 times, and by the time he did it a 3rd and 4th, like the first 2 times, I didn't get nothing out of it. So I'd done it again and again, and this was quite common. So sort of doing that, I guess, in a resource-restricted environment, the priority may be to get people to do 1 program each. But that might not. We might need to be putting them through several times. So release from prison and relapse. So 12 of the guys had previously been in, and 6 of them had relapsed within the first 24 hours, and 5 of those 6 had planned to do so, and they'd been planning from the moment they realised it was coming up. One of them ended up using sort of almost through circumstantial situation. And the other 6 relapsed within 6 months or less. Almost all of them returned to the same circumstances, the same accommodation, the same social, everything else. And as was described, it was like putting my old shoes back on. And if you go back to the same environment, perhaps it's not surprising that you end up using again. 3 of the guys spoke about this, and this would be sort of another bit of future research perhaps, is transferred directly to a residential rehabilitation from prison. So it got released, and from the prison gate you were sort of sent to a therapeutic community. But they all wanted to spend time with their family and with their partner, and the subtext with their partner bit was that they'd been in prison. So provided you're not having sex in prison, there may be other priorities when you get out of prison, when you want to catch up with your partner. So it's quite frustrating being transferred directly to a therapeutic community. Got Ed, who he ended up at his uncle's place, sort of serendipitously, really. He got a taxi driver who happened to know the family and said, "I'll take you to your uncle's." And he said, "Yeah, no worries." So he went to his uncle's place and he got there and they were hassling him, and his auntie really tried to force him to get out of the house, and you've got to go, and she tried to drive him out, and he just didn't want to go, and then he breached his sort of parole conditions and then ended up being on the run for a while. So perhaps a bit more of a thought within this space about how could there be ways in which people who are being released from prison can spend a bit of time with their family and then go to therapeutic community perhaps. So Aboriginal men, we're working with Aboriginal men, and we're nearly there. This is one of the final slides. So we've got Jim, he said he can't talk in a group, and I'll read through this. I told her I'll go there and sit and be mute. I can't talk in a group. So she, the parole officer, said, "How about the Aboriginal Medical Service? You can find someone to do one-to-ones." I said, "Yeah, probably." I found someone that I was more comfortable with, and that I continued with that when I was out. While I was on parole. And the fellow he was talking about, who he went and found, I know him. He is an elder in that community. And this really worked very well for Jim, and he wanted to reconnect with that particular counsellor again, and he felt that he got further working with this Aboriginal elder and talking to him about these issues than what he'd done with any other, even though he did relapse and end up going back to prison. So perhaps we need to have a good think about Aboriginal men working with Aboriginal men. And we did see a presentation yesterday from, I'm going to forget the name of the guys from the rehab down in Mornington Peninsula, which speaks exactly to this. And I can see Uncle Pat over there. So this is very much related to what you were talking about. So in terms of a summary of what we've looked at here, so there is a high and increasing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander imprisonment rate in this country. Alcohol and other drug treatments are needed, and we've got to remember alcohol in the mix here and not just focus upon the illicit drugs within this population. Our program facilitators need to have good empathy and confidentiality. Group dynamics, trust and confidentiality, again, I've got it there twice, but within a group context. So facilitators themselves need to be confidential, the groups need to be confidential. Further treatment, so Aboriginal men working with Aboriginal men. So in the future, perhaps we need to think about this and how do we get that to happen more and more within this space. Now, I am doing a keynote, so I thought I would indulge a little bit. And if I had a crystal ball, what I would say might happen and what I'd like to think about what could be happening within this space. I think there will be increased imprisonment. I think that you saw the rates of imprisonment of Aboriginal men in Western Australia. I would not be surprised if the other jurisdictions eventually get to that same rate, and that this continues the upward trend. There's nothing that appears to be really genuinely working towards abating that. There will be an attempt to put more diversion programs in order to try and prevent a further Aboriginal imprisonment or reduce it so that people don't go in, they end up in a diversion program, and there will be more post-release support offered as well. The two bottom things are good things in terms of responding to the increased Aboriginal imprisonment, but what's actually needed is to not make laws based on single examples. And we see this time and time again in this country, and probably many other countries around the world, is that when some really awful, horrible thing happens when somebody's on parole, the politicians make some kind of law that then makes it incredibly difficult for everybody to get parole out of a single example. And it always has this flow-on effect where it's increasing imprisonment, and for some reason, well, the most disadvantaged, not for some reason, it is just about the most disadvantaged people are the ones who suffer the most with that kind of policy making, and it's Aboriginal people. We do need to not have as many people in prison, whether they're Aboriginal or not, but we need to treat addiction through the health system rather than through the criminal justice, and I'd imagine everybody here would be fully agreeing with that. But, and I didn't talk about this, But I think we really do need to end imprisonment for financial reasons. So people who go to prison because they haven't paid fines and that sort of thing, and they're put in there, there's been some really horrible examples of this happening, people who have died while in custody because they were in there because they hadn't paid fines. It's kind of a bit of madness in a sense. So if somebody owed me $1,000 and somebody said, well, you can get your $1,000 back, but it'll cost you $2,000 to get it back, would you spend the $2,000 and still be $1,000 out of pocket? So you don't actually recoup any of the money people owe in fines, you just end up spending more money on top of that. And so at some point we need to really push towards ending financial imprisonment. So that's it for me. Thank you. I would like to thank two people, or a whole bunch of people, but I would like to thank Kate Conagrave, my boss, and Kylie Lee as well. They're our senior researchers in our team, and they are absolutely awesome. And all of our team at the Centre Research Excellence, Indigenous Health and Alcohol. So thank you.